At Parker, our purpose is simple. We want to make the world a better place by working more efficiently, by using more sustainable practices, by developing better technologies. We keep moving forward. With each new idea, innovation, and partnership, we're one step closer to fulfilling our purpose every single day. To find out more, visit parker.com/purpose. Parker, engineering your success.
Hi, welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, we're going to talk a little Taiwan, a little China. We talk about it here, there, and yonder, but people are using it as a comp that doesn't really apply. Zach Yost is with us. He's going to explain it to us, freelance writer, another Young Voices contributor, and he's got a good piece out on this in Law and Liberty we're going to discuss. Zach, how are you? Thank you for joining us on the program, sir.
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, it's died down a little bit as the war in Ukraine drags on, but we still hear a lot of this. Look, there's a natural inclination here because there's only so many major powers in the world, right? The U.S., China being supreme. Russia's kind of been diminished with the Ukraine situation for now. But at the beginning, a lot of people were like, oh, well, Russia invaded Ukraine, so that means China's going to invade Taiwan. It's not that China probably wouldn't like to do that, but there's not a good comp here for a lot of reasons. You lay them out. Give folks just kind of the big picture, though. Wow, that's kind of a lazy comp right off the jump, though.
Right. Yeah. As soon as the war broke out, lots of people in the foreign policy establishment were comparing Ukraine to Taiwan, saying that if we fail to stop this invasion, we being the whole West, but mostly the U.S., that'll give China the green light to invade Taiwan. But there are a lot of significant differences on multiple levels. On the purely strategic level, one of the major differences is that China is enormous. It's giant, and historically, this is also the case. A lot of its resources are already tied up, either patrolling and defending its 14,000 mile long border that's contested, especially with India and Vietnam, or garrisoning, their ginormous cities. About half of the entire Chinese military does just those two things. Secondly, on the tactical level, things could not be more different. Ukraine shares a giant land border with Russia. There is, that's why when the invasion started, Russia invaded on 4 or 5 fronts simultaneously. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of troops crossing at once. That's not possible for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It would necessarily be an amphibious landing, and logistically, it would make D-Day look like a picnic in terms of how complex it is. The weather patterns in the strait only have basically 2 windows for invasion, roughly in March and April, and roughly in September, October. China does not have the lift capacity to land 100,000 troops on Taiwan on the first day. And Taiwan itself is very defensible. For one thing, the Taiwanese have been preparing to defend the island for roughly 70 years. The number of beaches that can be landed on has decreased over the years thanks to literal decades of geoengineering. And when the Allies thought they'd have to invade what was then called Formosa during World War II, they estimated they would need a force ratio of 5-1 to invade, and that they'd sustain 100,000 casualties. Taiwan theoretically could field 2.5 million troops when you mobilize the reserves and whatnot. So it's not an easy feat. It's much harder than the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, Zach Yost joining us. Here's another part of it. The political calculation here. Look, China has a capable military, although we can debate how capable of it, how much of it is show, and just sheer numbers wise. They have a capable military. They could level the island if they really got it in their mind to. Part of the deterrent and part of the problem here is, and the reason you're talking about the amphibious nature, they need it intact. The entire calculation of this is if they took Taiwan, it's not just to eliminate them. They want it intact. They want what's there. A prolonged campaign wouldn't do that. They can't just wipe the island off the map. That doesn't achieve their goal either. That's part of the deterrent thing here is, one, You still got to cross water, which no matter how much technology you got, that's an old military problem as old as time, right? You still got to get across water. Two is they don't really want a prolonged campaign of destruction like they've seen in some of the cities in Ukraine because it's bad for business. It's bad for their perception. They'd have to garrison it and they'd have to clean it up, and it defeats the point of why they would invade in the first place. Is that kind of a good way to sum it all up?
Yeah, for sure. It's from the Chinese perspective, Taiwan is a breakaway province. And while they could just, yeah, as you say, start carpet bombing the island, theoretically, they want to integrate it into the rest of Chinese society. And yeah, just blowing it to smithereens would be the worst way to do that.
Yeah, Zach Yost joining us. We're going to link to his piece in Law and Liberty. You pointed out here warfare, without making everybody's eyes roll into the minutia of it, warfare has some pretty hard and fast rules to it. How big your force is. You already talked about the ratio of people you would need to assault a position. You got to have more people because you're going to lose them in the assault, that sort of things. The Chinese are not dumb. China's big thing with their military hasn't been really military conquest with what we've seen Russia do with the invasion of Ukraine. They have been projecting power. They want to show power. They want to look powerful. You laid it out. The defense of Taiwan, this would be a very, very bloody affair. They have to have the calculation somewhere in there that they just don't want to take the PR hit of putting their army in the field for what very well could be a very, very costly victory or even a straight out loss.
Right. Yeah. It's would be an immense gamble on their part. There are estimates all over the place. A recent series of war games based on publicly available information. In all of the base case scenarios, China loses. And it's a costly loss. In some situations, 30,000 troops are captured, basically stranded on the island. And you have to think how destabilizing this would be to the actual regime in China. I mean, even though they have the Great Firewall and all this suppression of information, there's actually a lot of unrest in China, and we just saw it recently with the protests against zero COVID, where they actually had to change their horrible policy because society was breaking apart. Can you imagine what it would be if there's this military disaster where tens of thousands of people are captured or killed? I mean, it would be risky to the Chinese, and I think that's why they're going to try and do whatever they can to avoid this sort of last-ditch gamble that, I mean, it would not it would be very risky on their part.
Yeah, Zach Yost joining us. You touch on an important part of this. We're talking about military deterrence, and that is important because a Taiwan that would be, very hard to attack, that's a deterrent. The Chinese are all about business right now. One of the great deterrents might just be that invading Taiwan would be really bad for business for China. They are in a look, they're not dumb. They have long-range plans. They know they've got some economic trouble on the horizon. They got demographic trouble on the horizon. Their entire policy right now has been to get rich before you start having economic trouble. They've tried to strike that iron when it's hot. War's bad for business. They're sitting there watching what's happening to the Russian economy because the Russians are coming to them for help, right? They're learning these lessons. Is just the invasion being bad for business, that's going to be as important as a deterrent as the military deterrent, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say as important, but I do think it would play a role, especially on the destabilizing front. I mean, Taiwanese companies, I mean, there's actually a lot of economic integration between Taiwan and the mainland. And if all these Taiwanese companies that employ, like millions of people on the mainland just stopped paying them when it became evident that an invasion was going to occur, because is also important to consider, it's not like this could just happen tomorrow. It'd be obvious, from this massive buildup of resources and troops and whatnot, that would also be a destabilizing effect. However, I think we're already seeing a lot of sort of economic disintegration. I mean, lots of factories, are moving to Vietnam and Indonesia and things like that. In the US, there's all this push, for nearshoring, relocating sort of economic ties to Central and South America and whatnot. I mean, I don't really buy into the theory that trade decreases the likelihood of conflict. We can just look at World War I. The UK was Germany's largest trading partner, things like that. But it certainly wouldn't hurt, I would say.
Yeah, Zach Yost joining us. Okay, let's talk about the military deterrence. Again, these aren't good comps, but one comp that I think will be applicable here is the discussion of what arms actually help and hurt. You brought it up in your piece. We're linking to the piece. Make sure you read the whole thing. Just giving people the best and the brightest and the most advanced heavy weapons from the U.S. arsenal is not always the best military fit for a particular situation. Again, Taiwan, it's an island. It's going to be a defensive campaign. Just sending them the best F-16s and Abrams and things like this, that might not be the best way to defend them. Talk about military deterrence and how we can actually do that. It doesn't always mean just the most expensive and the best military equipment all the time. There's layers to this, isn't there?
Yeah, and this is sort of a big point of contention between U.S. Military planners and the Taiwanese military, where even within Taiwan, there's this big debate where they theoretically shifted to an asymmetrical defensive strategy, but at the same time, they want to buy more fighter jets and, as you mentioned, the Abrams tanks and things like that, where there's a lot of question of how helpful those would be. A lot of planners think that it would make much more sense to basically just sell Taiwan, tens of thousands of naval mines and anti-tank and anti-aircraft, missile systems, very mobile, very inexpensive. There are in a lot of the Center for Strategic and International Studies just released this very large wargaming report. And in most of their scenarios, basically the entire Taiwanese and U.S. Air Force in the region is destroyed on the tarmac in the opening of the war. Taiwan does have airfields located, they have basically bunkers built into the sides of mountains that, could be hit with a nuke and they'd survive. But it's not anticipated that the Taiwanese Air Force is going to last very long at all. It probably makes much more sense for them to be investing in, very inexpensive drones, things like that. But there's sort of an aspect of, the heroic fighter pilot sort of, morale boost, and also just the old brass in the Taiwanese military wants peer systems with China. And it's just sort of, they're living in like the early 90s and before. The world has changed. They sort of need to get with the program, and even if they don't, Congress has authority over arms exports, so they can sort of basically say, we will sell you this stuff, we won't sell you that stuff. And if I can, it also leads to a huge issue with our current policy with Ukraine. In the State of the Union, Biden said that nothing is beyond American capacity. And when he said that, he echoed what was in his introduction to the 2022 National Defense Strategy, where he explicitly said nothing is beyond our capability. But scarcity exists. We can't do everything all at once. And CSIS just came out with a really great report with estimating how many years it's going to take to replace all of the arms and equipment we've already sent to Ukraine. And we're continuing to send them more. It's going to take years and years. Meanwhile, there's a $19 billion backlog of arms that Taiwan has already ordered. So, we can't do both, really, is what it comes down to, unless, we have a huge, shift in our defense industrial base, which will, inevitably eat up resources elsewhere.
Yeah, Zach Yost joining us. Everybody's watching Russia and Ukraine. These are going to be the lessons learned for foreign policy and war fighters for the foreseeable future, because we learn every time we do one, right? What's going to be the lesson for the Taiwanese? We talk about the Chinese angle on this. We talk about the U.S. angle on it. You just mentioned it. Taiwan has their own views on this thing. When they see that invasion and they're watching the Ukrainians right now, what lesson do you think they're taking from all this right now?
Well, I think one lesson there's a few lessons I can think of that I think are applicable. One is that resistance is not futile. I mean, the U.S. military was saying for weeks before the invasion started that Ukraine would fall in like 2 or 3 weeks. Well, here we are a year later. I mean, the Ukrainian military, not in that great shape. I mean, they have a bunch of old Soviet junk, basically. I mean, they've had huge, horrific losses, but they're still standing there. So I would say that one is that resistance isn't futile if people actually resist. Second, I would say that there's really, it will drive home the need to take into consideration the future of air power. These sort of skies in Ukraine are sort of a gray zone. No one side really has air superiority, thanks to the proliferation of anti-aircraft missiles and whatnot. And Taiwan does have a lot of anti-aircraft systems. So I think they need to focus on increasing that capacity and also reconsider, is it worth the expense of maintaining all these fighter jets that will probably be blown up, within 2 or 3 days? Another thing I think they need to take away, which really every world power needs to take away, is how resource intensive this war is. I mean, the U.S. is used to fighting, in Afghanistan and Iraq or Libya, where we just bomb, technologically unsophisticated opponents to smithereens. I mean, the U.S. has already given Ukraine over 1 million artillery shells. At our current rates of production, we cannot replace those. I mean, we have to ramp up production, things like that. Were this war to occur, I mean, one estimate is Taiwan would run out of artillery shells within 3 months. So I think people really need to take stock of just how costly a war like this would be and stockpile appropriately.
Yeah, and ammunition goes a lot faster than anybody estimates it. I'll tell you that right up front. Zach Yost, good stuff. Appreciate it. We're going to link to the piece. It's in Law and Liberty. You can read the whole thing for yourself. This is something to keep an eye on. Look, this is something we've been talking about for decades. You brought it up. We've been basically talking about this for 70 years. Hopefully we'll be talking about it for another 70 years, because that means the war that everybody fears didn't happen, my friend. Let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with you until we get you back on Hertel again.
Sure. So people can follow me on Twitter. It's just at Zachary Yost. And I'm also the co-host of the War, Economy, and State podcast hosted by the Mises Institute. I co-host that with Ryan McMakin, where just once a month, usually, we sit down and talk about do an in-depth dive into foreign policy topics from, a restraint and realism perspective.
Great. We'll have links to all that in the show notes. Zach Yost, appreciate the time, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
Religion is at the intersection of our 21st century life, even if we don't express a faith. At a time when it seems that religion isn't as prevalent as it once was, it still leaves its mark everywhere. As a pastor, I know that religion isn't something I just do on a Sunday, but it's found in every nook and cranny of my life. Sexuality, politics, social media, the economy, war, nationalism, all have some kind of religious angle to them. And as a communicator, I want to find the stories that can help people understand this part of our society that is so important to so many. Hi, I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm the host of Church and Main. Church and Main is a podcast about the journey of faith and where it intersects with modern life. I look at faith with a journalist's eye, asking the who, where, what, why, and how religion affects some of the major issues of the day. Join me as we journey together. You can listen to Church and Main podcasts at the website churchandmain.org or on your favorite podcast app. I look forward to seeing you.
Folks, you've heard of Ethan Brown on the Heard Tell Show a couple of different times, but if you're interested in learning about how to discuss things like climate change without all the politics and doom and gloom, head over to his podcast, The Sweaty Penguin. Sweaty Penguin is a late-night comedy-style climate podcast working to add nuance, critical thinking, humor, and hope to the climate conversation. They got over 100 episodes already, breaking down weekly news stories and specific topics, from the vanilla to the ADHD to the international accountability to orangutans. Yes, I know, it's a comedy thing, so just go with it. But each time, exploring different ways we can make progress on these issues while still helping the economy, health, security, and everything else we care about. Feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or excluded by today's climate change discourse? This is the podcast for you. Find The Sweaty Penguin wherever you get your podcasts or at www.thesweatypenguin.com.